Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, and where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today's the review so many of you have been waiting for. Artpop by Lady Gaga. So here it is. The review of which you all have been eagerly anticipating. You know what? It's a little amazing how many people left comments asking that I review this album, as if I wasn't gonna bother, which to me, it was more than a little funny. This album's hype machine has been working in overdrive for the past couple of months. You honestly didn't think I wasn't going to review it, right? Because here's the funny thing. I love talking about Lady Gaga. Hell, most critics do. She's the kind of artist who might not always make the best music, but she always makes interesting music, and the fact that she's defiantly committed to making pop music suggests a real populist streak that I really appreciate and do like. Plus, for the most part, she's a pretty solid artist in her own right, having written several songs that I like a great deal. Is she arrogant or occasionally far too pretentious for her own good? Well, absolutely. But in most cases, that's more of a feature rather than a criticism, and it's bellied by her broad spectrum of musical influences and her willingness to experiment with different styles. She's a pop culture junkie, just like me, and the fact that she clearly loves what she's doing and throws herself into it mercilessly earns a lot of my respect. Now, all that being said, I can't help but feel that some of the popular acclaim that she's received might be a little bit misplaced, because really, she's made only one consistently great album. I mean, the Fame was pretty good, but after the first 5 songs, it takes a real nosedive in quality. The Fame Monster was definitely a lot stronger as it stretched into darker, more subversive territory, and it's arguably her best work. But let's be honest, songs like Telephone are just not as strong as they should be, especially when compared with Bad Romance or Teeth. As for Born This Way, well, I can appreciate the broad variety of experimentation and influences that do lead to some fantastic songs like You and I and Americano and Hair, but it also cast into sharper relief some of my big issues with Lady Gaga. That despite all of the well-crafted artifice, she really doesn't have much more substance beneath the flash and the glamour besides self-obsession, exploration of the whole concept of fame, and surface-level references to other genres. And while as a pop culture geek, I like and I get those references, I always find myself disappointed that there isn't more beneath the references, that she isn't trying to say more with those references, instead just drawing attention that she's making them. I like that she's driving the aesthetics of pop music into a darker direction. I definitely do. I can appreciate that. I just wish that she had something more to say with that shift. As I've mentioned before, pop music doesn't have to be about nothing. It can actually have some meaning and weight behind it. But then again, she's taken a fair amount of time off and she's come back with an album titled Artpop, which Lady Gaga has described herself as subscribing to a reverse Warholian formula. Now, this is actually kind of interesting because while Warhol was interested in exposing the art and commercialism, Gaga is looking to flip that around, to bring the art culture into the commercialism sphere, using her own populism to introduce normally inaccessible elements into mainstream acceptance. Now, let me make this absolutely clear. On a conceptual level, I love this idea. And you know what? Lady Gaga might be one of the few pop stars who could actually pull it off. But this sort of plan carries a lot of risk, as it implies that Gaga will, on her sheer populism and skill alone, be able to pull some normally inaccessible genres into the mainstream. Can she pull it off? In a way, she does on this album, but not in the way that I was expecting or hoping for. It also makes Artpop an album that's rather frustrating to talk about, because it's a really interesting case and one you don't really see very often. It's an album that effectively succeeds in what it's trying to do, but doesn't quite go the necessary extra step to really stand out and become something really special. And even despite the artistic success, I find that I don't like this album as much as I wanted to. Okay, let me put this another way. I respect Artpop a fair amount more than I like it, and yet I can't help but feel disappointed with it. I can acknowledge that it's mostly good and will probably get a recommendation from me at the end, because at least she's trying to do something new and interesting. But it doesn't have the breadth of conceptual experimentation that Born This Way had, or the killer hooks of The Fame or The Fame Monster. In short, I can't help but feel that Artpop is her weakest album to date. And while I'm going to make the argument that it ultimately succeeds in its intent, it doesn't really do so in a particularly compelling or memorable way, and that's ultimately a really big problem. Okay, So let's start with the unquestionable positives, most of which are linked to Gaga herself. This is probably the most raw and emotionally invested she's ever sounded in her material, and her energy does a lot to elevate the subject matter into something that a listener might actually care about. She wants to make this stuff sound awesome, in another way of putting it. She's got a wide range, an incredibly expressive and emotional voice with real texture, and she does not shy away from throwing herself into her music with complete aplomb. It also helps matters that she has a great voice and a ton of natural charisma. She's a born pop star, and she sounds better here than she ever has. It's clear that she definitely cares about the subject material, and she's determined to try and make us care about it as well. And you know what? I'll say this for her as well. You can tell there's a lot of effort and care placed into all these tracks. You can tell that a lot of work was done, from the instrumentation to the production to the lyrics. You can tell that Lady Gaga specifically designing every single little facet of this album to convey her specific message, and that each piece plays a very specific role in articulating that message. In comparison with her friend Justin Timberlake's album, either of them that he released this year, there's not an ounce of bloat on this album, which makes it for a shockingly quick listen. And that kind of makes sense. Gaga is still making pop music, even for her desire to incorporate elements from the art world into it. And here's where we run into the elephant in the room almost immediately, where we have to discuss arguably the biggest strength and the biggest weakness of this album. Because Lady Gaga does indeed succeed in bringing elements of the art world into the mainstream culture with this album. In a way, she doesn't so much bring in the big ideas or concepts or understandings of the art world as much as she brings in the aesthetics of the art world, specifically the opulent upper-class art world common in cities like New York and Paris and not many other places. So in other words, we get a lot of all manner of the flash and the glitz and the glam, and an obsession with high fashion and an overloaded emphasis on sexuality for its own sake. And you know what? I'll give Gaga this. You can definitely tell she knows that scene, and she does a very good job capturing it within her music. And here's where we run into the first big problem. In capturing the aesthetics of the art world instead of the bigger ideas and concepts behind it, the album feels astoundingly superficial. Yes, I know Lady Gaga places a lot of weight in the aesthetics, and she's trying to get us to feel the same, but without touching on the ideas or potential ramifications of art that she's trying to express. It feels like we're only touching on the surface here. And you know what? That would be fine if that was Lady Gaga's point, that most people seldom get beyond the surface of the art that they experience. But it's clear from the opening track Aura that she wants us to go deeper and find that depth, when really that depth isn't there. Instead, on tracks like Donatella and Fashion, we get a wealth of brand names and buzzwords and not much else. And then there's tracks like Jewels and Drugs and Mary Jane Holland and Applause, which seem to only be emphasizing the theme that Lady Gaga sure is having a good time and that she's awesome and rich and incredibly empowered, and obviously we should just aim to be like her. It's reveling in this raw, shallow excess, and frankly, I didn't find it compelling. Mostly because of a broad lack of imagination in the instrumentation and greatly lessened populism. Instead of bringing art ideas to the mainstream, she brought the snobbish, pretentious, generally insufferable art attitude to the mainstream instead, where we're all supposed to believe this stuff is deep when really it's not. Lovely. Now, look, Lady Gaga has already prepared herself for this criticism on Applause. I'll give her this, she is self-aware, where she attacks critics who have the nerve to point out that the musical inspirations that she has for her art aren't nearly as revolutionary as she might think. And she has a point about this. There's nothing wrong with drawing influences from the past, and critics who make reductive statements about an act's quality by just sniffing and saying, well, Madonna did it first. Well, that doesn't help the critical discussion. But here's the point I'm going to make, Miss Gaga. As a pop geek myself, I have no problem with you drawing in influences and sounds from obscure scenes of the past or the underground today. What my problem is that you're not doing anything all that special with those influences. You're not using those influences in specific styles to explore new ideas or deeper meaning, but instead focusing on reveling in the atmosphere and the environment of the art world for art for its own sake, instead of any residual ideas behind the art. And to me, that just strikes me as lazy. And what's worse about all this is that she jettisoned some of her populist appeal by going in this particular direction. Like, look, let's be honest here. The majority of people who are going to listen to this album will never ever see the high art circles of wealth and fashion and opulence that Lady Gaga is singing about here. And when she's spent so much of her songs bragging about living in those worlds, you lose some of that connection with your audience. Sure, she might be trying to get people to empathize with her or try to elevate them and give them that form of escapism, but then why are the tracks so overloaded with her bragging about how much money she has? Like, I'm sorry, Lady Gaga, but you know what? That's not compelling, and that's not exactly going to be something that's going to draw me into your world or want to spend any time in that world at all. But then again, the life of art and high fashion aren't the only areas where Lady Gaga focuses her attention. Nope, of course we get a very large focus on sex. Primarily lesbian sex on songs like GUI, Sex Dreams, and Manicure, and then just regular vanilla sex and Venus and Do What You Want. The Prince influence here is unmistakable, but honestly, I don't have the same level of issues with the concepts of these songs because, you know what, they aren't trying to be deep or meaningful. Or at least I hope they're not, because they're not deep or meaningful whatsoever. I mean, Sex Dreams might be the most inappropriate karaoke song since Divinal's big hit, and Venus contains a lot of Greek and Roman mythology to be sure, and then ruins it with a terrible Uranus joke last seen in Harry Potter. And look, I have to be honest, despite the great groove behind Do What You Want and hiring R. Kelly to deliver an incredibly sexual and convincing verse, I'm really kind of uncomfortable with the sentiment where Gaga asserts that her mind, her heart, her voice, and her life are impenetrable from any sort of threat, and then she adds, do what you want with my body. And now look, as somebody who's not a prude at all, is anybody who thinks that sends a little bit of an uncomfortable message to girls who are listening to this sort of song? It just didn't work for me on a lyrical level the same way, which is a real shame because the groove is great. But you know what, I will say this, the album does strike two big hits for me with Dope and Gypsy, mostly because they feel more real and accessible than anything else on this album because they actually feel somewhat vulnerable. Lady Gaga comes across as human on these songs, and it's a huge strength for her because she can convey emotions incredibly well in this range. They show the downside to living the high life and the constant travel, how it can be crushingly lonely when you're on your own, and how you want to hold on to love even when your passions might take you elsewhere. The thing is that they're the only songs that feel real and impactful on this album for me, and they only empathize how shallow so much of this album feels. And really, the sad fact is that the instrumentation doesn't really help matters. Sure, there are some moments with some interesting melodies and ideas, like the opening guitar on Aura, a rock edge on Manicure that I liked, a phenomenally hollow synth groove on Do What You Want, and some little great piano moments that show that Lady Gaga is still a phenomenal keyboardist. But most of the instrumentation is just this cold electro-pop dance beats, and they lack a lot of character and uniqueness in comparison with the rest of the scene, especially in comparison with Born This Way's eclectic sound that drew from all over the map. What's kind of ironic in a twisted way is that while Gaga appropriates art aesthetics for her lyrics, she didn't do so for instrumentation, which is not nearly as weird as it clearly thinks it is. And it's not nearly weird or eclectic as most mainstream pop, and most indie rockers would probably be laughing at it. And you know, this is really quite frustrating because while this might be Lady Gaga's most cohesive album to date, it's also on an instrumental level her least interesting, especially when it comes to good melodies. Now this is becoming a very big problem in the mainstream pop industry, where they're replacing catchy melody hooks with just beats that hammer a simple progression of notes that don't really develop outside of that. And this culminates in the issue that they makes the songs a lot less memorable, and I gotta be honest, that was a big problem when I was listening through this album. Ugh. Look, this review is coming off a lot more negative than I would have liked, but I really wanted to get into this album. I really wanted to love it, and you know what? I just can't in the same way. Because make no mistake, there are some good songs on this album that I do recommend, and it's ultimately going to give Artpop a recommendation from me. But there aren't a lot of great songs. There aren't a lot of songs that I'm going to be revisiting, and they're probably not going to make my end of the year list. I'm significantly underwhelmed by this album, and the more I listen to it, the less I like it. For now, it's a 7 out of 10. As I said, I respect this album more than I like it, because I'll argue that it accomplished its goal, but it didn't accomplish the goal in a particularly compelling way, and it still feels significantly shallower than it should, even for a pop album, because Lady Gaga clearly had some broad, big emotions for delivering this album, and you know what? The aftermath of it just feels incredibly underwhelming. Look, Gaga, I hate to say this, but I expected more from you here, and I know you're capable of more, but I'm looking past the aura and I'm not seeing much underneath it all. And I'd really like you to prove me wrong on that. Yeah, so thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Just keep in mind, I really want to like this album, guys, and if you did, I'm happy for you. I just wish I could feel the same. Until then, see you next time.